what does the word patriarchy even mean? Is it about blaming men now and putting all of the cultural oppression that women and minorities have suffered for 6,000 years onto them? This is a common mistake that I do find people making when I mention the word patriarchy. They think it's about blaming men, but it's not. It's actually about understanding the invisible structure that forms and is at the foundation of our society. This invisible structure shapes everything, including our religion, our history, our stories, our society, and of course, our politics, which in turn shapes all of our belief systems, believe it or not. But no one talks about this. No one talks about this invisible structure that forms not only these outwardly social constructs, but also our inner world of how we think, see, and believe the world to be. We just take it as fact that this has always been the case. But what if it's not? What if knowing that this wasn't the only structure that society has ever lived in helped you to see a different past, present, and future? In this video, we are going to look at this high-level view of how patriarchy came to be, most likely, we don't know for sure, and really understand the stories that got laid at the foundation of this structure, of this framework, of this foundation, and what it means for us today. Throughout this series, we're going to use this understanding of how patriarchy got established in order to look back at history and myths and the current political socio-system that we live in today. By doing this, by looking back through a patriarchal lens to understand how we got to where we are today, you might just be able to start to see the past, present, and the future in a completely new way. At least that's my hope.
Jumping in and the editing stage to encourage you to grab a piece of paper and a pencil or pen and take some notes. These are really meaty lessons, and I want you to be able to really integrate this work inside of yourself and probably do that for each of these lessons. Also, I'm going to have you take a moment to do what's called a golden nugget at the end of every lesson, at the end of every video, where you're really going back and looking at your notes and leaving that golden nugget for me in the comment section of what are you taking away? What is the biggest point for you from that lesson? Lastly, before we get started, I also want you to stay to the very end because I'm going to give you a really powerful exercise that when I used to teach this in person at things called red tents with women, I would ask them to do this. And so many of us will struggle with this exercise. And it's going to really help show you how ingrained patriarchy is into your thinking that you probably haven't even noticed. So stay to the very end to get that tool and exercise.
First, let's get on the same page about how to understand the word patriarchy from the lens that I want you to see it from. When I want to start to understand a word or an idea that is maybe a little mucky in this day and age, I often look at the etymology, the root word of where this word comes from. Now, this is not necessarily the definition of a word, but it's understanding the lineage, the DNA, since we're going to be talking about cultural DNA. Patriarchy comes from the Greek word patriarchia. I believe I'm saying that correctly, where Pater, P-A-T-E-R, means father, and archy means to govern or rule. In its simplest form, patriarchy simply means that a society is structured so that it is passed down and ruled through the male line. Now, over time, it has been developed, patriarchy has been, into this dominator type of society, where the structure is about having power over others and being able to dictate what they can and cannot be, what they can and cannot think, and how they show up in that society. This is not the actual start of what patriarchy means, but this is what patriarchy has developed into today. Now, I want you to think about that word patriarchy as being the invisible framework, the foundation of a home or a skyscraper. Now, you can't see that structure, that foundation, that framework once the house or skyscraper starts to be built, but it must be there in order to hold that house or that skyscraper up. Patriarchy and the way that it's gotten structured in our society is the same way. We often don't see the framework that has built us up into this societal constructs and the gender roles and the way we show up in society based on those gender roles, but they're still there. It's holding up the society. And this is what we're trying to peel away and get into the heart of so that we can deconstruct. I'm going to just say this up front. Of course, there are always exceptions to the rule. Some women and minorities might rise up into the social classes and become that exception of being in the upper echelons of in whatever role that they have. But this is the exception. It is not the rule. This also might mean on a daily basis, you don't really necessarily feel patriarchy within your home or within your community or your workplace because maybe you work with all women or maybe you work with women and minorities. It's just not something that you feel. However, it's still a societal structure. So that structure is still holding up everything around you that you are dancing in and interacting with on a daily basis, even if it doesn't touch you intimately. I want to be very clear at this point in time. In my definition of patriarchy, it is not about blaming men. It is not about making women above men or minorities above men. It is simply about labeling a structure of society so that we know what we are dealing with. That way we can actually dismantle that structure and create something new. I also want to put here as a caveat that people often think that the opposite of patriarchy, what we should be aiming for, is matriarchy. I, in my research, have found that this is actually not what we want to do either, because it would just be the flip side. Remember, pater means father, mater means mother. So we don't necessarily want to flip-flop and have women all in the power and control. My goal is really to look towards the partnership societies that were established throughout the world before patriarchy came to be across the globe about 6,000 years ago. We're not really sure how that happened, but through the anthropology, we do see that a lot of societies lived more through a matrifocal or matrilineal line. Now, that simply means that the line of the family ran through the woman's line. And there were a couple of reasons that they could look back at and see this by studying cultures that still are in existence like this today. Now, this actually takes away the knowledge of who the kids' fathers are, forcing the men in the community to actually act as uncles to all of the children, and it would evolutionarily benefit the tribe when this happened. So this is what matrilineal or matrifocal means. It also meant that the tribes tended to be more egalitarian type community where they shared the domestic and socio-political responsibilities of everyone equally based on their skills, not based on their gender. Here is something I wanted to read from Rain Eisler's work, who wrote the book The Chalice and the Blade. Some of the other work that I have that I will also mention a lot is The Creation of Patriarchy by Gerda Lerner. And then there's a powerful book, Sex at Dawn, that talks about the evolution through the sexual lens, which is also infusing a lot of the work that I do. Rain Eisler's search for answers took her into a deep, multidisciplinary study of human history, and her book, The Chalice and the Blade, is based on a rereading of 30,000 years of human culture. I'm going to pause there. Human culture has been around for more than 30,000 years. This is investigating 30,000 years. I want you to keep in mind that patriarchy, as we know it, has only been in existence for 6,000 years. So it's not the majority of history that is so important for us to remember. It's the majority of written history. So that's what we think we know, but there's a lot of history we don't know because it was not yet written down. I'm going back to her reading here. Eisler showed that for millennia, human societies were structured as what she called partnership societies or partnership systems. While not ideal, these were societies in which our capacity to give, nurture, and sustain life were celebrated and revered as divine. Women and men shared power, and a spirit of mutual care and responsibility prevailed. The existence of this ancient social configuration, long before the systems of domination, i.e. patriarchy, which followed, help us understand that we don't have to accept conquest, violence, and abuse as just human nature. Isn't that powerful? Oh, I love that. So to wrap this first section up, I want to just reiterate that patriarchy is not about blaming men or the elite. It is a structure. When I use that word, it is pointing towards the structure that dominates the foundation of how we are built as a society, and that has become invisible throughout the 6,000 years of history, and it has become what we would call a dominator structure. Moving on, we're going to jump into Gerda Lerner's work in her creation of patriarchy patriarchy. She started to write Creation of a Feminine Consciousness and realized she couldn't write that book until she understood how we got into the system of patriarchy. And really, I'm going to talk about this in a second, the ideas that built our society. In her first chapter, in her introduction, she outlines 10 steps that took about 2,500 years from about 31,000 BCE in order to establish patriarchy. It was not just one event, it was these 10 events spread out over 2,500 years that created the society that we know it. And this is why it's so invisible, because by the time we got to the end of the 2,500 years, they just looked around and assumed that this is how things had always been. Because remember, history didn't start being written down until about 3,500 BCE. So we didn't have anything to look back on and say, well, there was something different. So keep that in mind as we read these 10 steps that Gerder outlines in her book. Now, each of these steps forms a foundation of one of the chapters that dives into the information deeper. So I'm going to pull some of that information out for us as we talk about each of these points. But stick with me, because this is foundational for the rest of the work that I will do on this channel, not just this series, in understanding what a patriarchal lens means. It means understanding these 10 steps. Number one, the appropriation by men of women's sexual and reproductive capacity occurred prior to the formation of private property and class society. Its, or the sexual and reproductive capacity, lies, in fact, at the foundation of private property. So I'm going to pause here and pull out a few facts that's so important for us to understand. This was the first step that was happening around 3100 BCE, probably a little earlier. Again, it wasn't just one event, but it was over the course of hundreds of years. That really meant so many different things. So one, the foundation of patriarchy is the right it believes it has to control another person, oftentimes just through a body part. That starts with women, but it goes on into many other things through slavery and even into modern era with our health system. Number two, private property as the ability to claim land for one family line is at the bedrock of patriarchy. And number three, it ties women's sexual and reproductive capacity to private property. So you have to keep those three in mind, that patriarchy's foundation has a right to control other people's bodies and their autonomy, that it puts private property at the foundation, and that private property is tied to women's sexual and reproductive capacity. Moving on to her second step. Number two, archaic states were organized in the form of patriarchy, i.e. the structure of society where everything goes through the male line. Thus, from its inception, the state has had an essential interest in the maintenance of the patriarchal, i.e. male line of the family. Number three, men learned to institute dominance and hierarchy over other people by their earlier practice of dominance over the women of their group, i.e. this is how slavery got born. They understood how to enslave subliminally women of their own culture. They extended that to the culture of other tribes, starting with the women, and then eventually through other means of psychological warfare, they were able to dominate the children and men of other cultures. So that is how this institution of slavery got started. Number four, the earliest laws institutionalized and enforced with the full power of the state women's sexual subordination. Women's cooperation in the system was secured by various means: force, economic dependency on the male head of the family, class privileges bestowed upon conforming and dependent women of the upper class, and the artificially created division of women into respectable or tied to a man and not respectable women or not tied to a man or free of all men. Number five, class for men is not based on their relation to their sexual production, but was and is based on their relationship to the means of production. Those who owned the means of production could dominate those who did not. For women, class is mediated through their sexual ties to men, i.e. being a respectable woman, who then gives them access to material resources. The division of women into respectable, again, that attached to a man, and not respectable, or those not attached to a man or free of all men, is institutionalized in laws pertaining to the veiling of women. And so she goes into that chapter where, women were distinguished by their veil or lack of veil. Number 6, long after women's sexual and economic subordination to men for about 2,000 years into patriarchy start, women are still playing active and respected roles in mediating between humans and gods as priestesses, seers, diviners, and healers. Metaphysical female power, especially the power to give life, is worshipped by men and women in the form of powerful goddesses long after women's subordination in all other areas of their life. I'm going to pause here because this is so important to get as well. People often think that patriarchy was created by religion, and it's actually the reverse. And we're going to get into this in the next point, but the government is what started patriarchy. And about 2,000 years of that then established the one male religion, not the other way around. We still had powerful goddesses all the way up through this 2,000-year point into patriarchy. That is why we still have some of these stories that I'm using over on my fiction side of my work. If you want to hear some of that, go to the story time for adults in my YouTube section. We're able to trace back the roots of some of these women and really peel away the patriarchal lens that they have had put on them to understand perhaps what they used to believe before patriarchy. Number 7, the dethroning of the powerful goddesses and their replacement by the dominant male god occur in most Near Eastern societies following the establishment of a strong and imperialistic kingship. So that's what I just pointed to in the first and number 6. Gradually, the function of controlling fertility, formerly entirely held by the goddess, is symbolized to the symbolic or actual mating of the male god or god king with the goddess or her priestess. Finally, sexuality, eroticism, and procreativity are split in the emergence of separate goddesses for each function, and the mother goddess is transformed, i.e. demoted, into the wife consort of the chief male god. So you can think about it like this. It was goddess, and then, somewhere along the line, people realized men had some part of it, so goddess and consort, and then it became goddess and god, and then it became god and consort, and then it became just God, and we did away with the female aspect of it in our divinity and our spirituality. Number 8, the emergence of the Hebrew monotheism takes the form of an attack on the widespread cults of the various fertility goddesses. The pantheon of the Hebrew, of the Jewish culture used to be a thing. Eventually that became what is called a henotheism. You can say that 5 times fast, which meant that they didn't necessarily discredit that other gods existed. It just meant that their God was supreme. This actually helps you make sense of some of these Old Testament verses where it says there is no other God before me, which if there is only one God, then there's no other God. So why do you even have to say that? Well, this helps that make sense, is that Judaism went from a pantheon to a henotheism to monotheism. Back to Gerder's writing here. In the writing of the book of Genesis, creativity and procreativity are ascribed to an all-powerful God whose epitaphs of Lord and King establish him as a male god, and female sexuality other than for procreative purposes becomes associated with sin and evil. What Miss Lerner says later in her chapter on this topic is that the monotheistic God eventually takes on power to grow and create life itself. How the monotheistic God became both parts, but also is always talked about in the male form, because that really structures our thoughts about the divinity, which we'll get into in later videos as well. Number 9, in the establishment of the covenant community, the basic symbolism and the actual contract between God and humanity in the creation story of Genesis, which happens to form most of the Western world, assumes as a given the subordinate position of women and their exclusion from the metaphysical covenant and the earthly covenant community. Their only access to God and to the holy community is in their function as mothers. So let's break this down. She doesn't give a necessary timeline in the introduction, but this is probably somewhere around that 2,000-year mark where women are starting to get displaced and demoted out of spirituality altogether. By that time, again, remember, we only have written history from about 4,000 BCE. So people don't understand that there used to be something else besides patriarchy. That is how it became a given that women were just subordinate. So when people started to write about the position of women versus men, that was all they had to understand the society around them. They couldn't have conceived of any anything else because there was nothing else written down for them to know that there was something else. And archaeology, anthropology, sociology had not been invented yet. The other important thing that I wanted to point out here that she doesn't mention in the introduction, and I don't remember if she mentions it in this chapter, is yes, that their connection to the divinities through their role as mother. And this is why so many women don't feel like they become women until they have given birth, because it's the only spiritual connection that they have to the divinity, but also that they could get through to God via the men, via their husband, via the pastor or priest. I just wanted to pull out that there was other ways for them to access God, but it was always at a male headship. Number 10, the symbolic devaluing of women in relation to the divine becomes one of the founding metaphors, i.e. stories, of Western civilization. The other founding metaphor, i.e. story, is supplied by the philosophy of Aristotle, which assumes as a given that women are incomplete and damaged human beings of entirely different order than men, i.e. that they are incomplete in development into men. Pause. By the time Genesis was written, the common belief was that women were of a different order than men. They were incomplete in their development into men. That is what the Genesis writers believed all the way through Jesus. Now, if that doesn't give you a different idea of what Jesus meant by equality, it simply meant he was going to make women men so that they could get into heaven, because that's how he understood the difference between men and women. It is with the creation of these two metaphorical constructs, i.e. stories, which are built into the very foundations of the symbol systems, i.e. religious and socio-political language, that the subordination of women comes to be seen as natural. Hence, it becomes invisible. It is this which finally establishes patriarchy firmly as an actuality and as an ideology. Now that we have that invisible structure made visible through understanding the 10 steps in her book, The Creation of Patriarchy, I want to take a moment out just to talk about the effects of patriarchy, because I don't think it affects just women and minorities and people of different gender identities. It affects all of us, but in different ways. And peeling back the layers to understand that is part of this work that we're going to be doing as well. So first, let me just say capitalism, which is an offshoot of the creation of patriarchy, of this dominator culture, affects all of them. I think we could agree with that. It is driving all of us into exhaustion and depleting our inner and outer resources at rates that we are not able to replenish. Patriarchy also really hurts men. So let's look at that for a moment. For example, they are taught to suppress their emotions, and that anger and pridefulness are really the only emotions that they're allowed to express. They are taught from a young age, from their play dates, that violence, that rage, that going after others with dominance and oppression is good. And then they take that into their adulthood years, where they run the society via politics, the CEO boardroom, and our religions. But where I think it hurts men the most is that it has stopped men from evolving emotionally. In place of them evolving emotionally, women and minorities have had to carry the invisible social and emotional burden of creating and maintaining the society behind them. So now they're getting that ripped away from them, and they feel like they're being oppressed. This explains why so many men come out against the feminist movement, because they have to carry the weight of their emotional and social world now, and they're not used to doing that. They're used to being able to mandate the people that they have power and control over to do that for them. And they don't like that. That feels uncomfortable. Of course it does. But it's going to be so important for women that we can't fall back into that homeostasis role of saving them from that uncomfortableness. We have to let them get uncomfortable.
Right, I'm going to jump in here with a little bit of a tangent. I wanted to define the word homeostasis. It actually comes from biology, and it means that any self-regulating process by which a biological system internally tends to try to maintain stability. The stability attained represents a dynamic equilibrium in which continuous change occurs, yet relatively uniform conditions prevail. So this simply means this is the process by which our bodies are constantly receiving feedback from our environment and also from our internal bodies to regulate things such as blood glucose levels, our temperature. Our bodies are always trying to get and stay within homogeneous if I got that word right. I had to go listen to it. They're trying to always be, at 98.7, our temperature. I think that's what our temperature is. Our glucose levels need to always be at this certain level. If you're a female, your hormones shift and change a lot over the course of the cycle of the month, but there's this baseline for each part of that phase that the body is constantly getting that feedback to try to maintain that system within those homogeneous order, the stability within the inside. But that's the process of homeostasis. It's taking all the biofeedback and trying to make sure that we get back into homogenesis. I can never say the word. This term can also be used in a social aspect, though, and that's what I wanted to really define here. So I wanted to define that in my own words to help you really understand what's happening or what I'm using this word for. To me, it's a process by which the unconscious social system intuits a disturbance in the biosphere, in that social system, and puts pressure on that disturbance to get back in line so the social system can get back to the baseline, which is patriarchy. So an example, I did a TikTok video. I think I put it also on my YouTube if you want to go watch this, but it happened at a football game last season. I was talking to this beautiful elder woman, one of those women that just has gotten to the point in her life where she doesn't give a what about anything around her. I don't think she ever did. She just spoke her mind, and patriarchy doesn't like women speaking their mind. Even though she'd raised the son, for some reason, he was still trying to get her back in line. I mean, I think it had something to do with maybe he didn't want her to embarrass him in front of me, but he was actually the one embarrassing himself by doing this thing called homeostasis and eavesdropping on our conversation and coming over and trying to get her to shut up, essentially, and be quiet and get back in lines. All the men look great and they don't have to answer to anybody and they don't have to evolve their emotional toolbox because they get to shut everybody up. That's an act of homeostasis.
I believe in the coming years, we're also going to see the shift evolving into the social class system, where the minions of us are not going to take on the burden for the elites anymore. And the elites are going to come out saying that they are now being oppressed because they have to feel the weight of their unevolvedness, if you will, and do the work to evolve with the rest of us. At least that's my hope, in a very creative way. So I'm going to reiterate all of this. This is not a rebellion. This is a wake-up call. It is a wake-up call for the elite and the men that have been benefiting. Again, I don't believe they truly benefit from the society, but benefit from it more than the rest of us, to wake up and do the emotional evolution work that is required of them at this time. And the rest of us to not pick up the homeostasis weight of that for them, that we let them fall down and learn how to pick themselves up. That's just how evolution works. Here's the key. When the masses at the bottom understand this system as I've laid out, then it's going to force evolution to happen. It's going to become undeniable. Now that we have a framework for understanding the invisible foundation of patriarchy that creates our society, I want to talk about how this might feel different than how other people use the word patriarchy and their understanding of patriarchy. I am more interested in the ideas that built patriarchy, not in the facts or events that occurred because of these ideas. It is working with the ideas that we will be able to actually deconstruct from patriarchy. Let me read this excerpt from Gerda Lerner's book, The Creation of Patriarchy. What is the relationship of ideas, and specifically of ideas about gender, to the social and economic forces that shape history? The matrix of any idea is reality. People cannot conceive of something they have not themselves experienced, or at least that others have before them experienced. Thus, images, metaphors, myths all find expression in forms which are prefigured throughout our past experiences. In periods of change, people reinterpret these symbols in new ways, which then lead to new combinations and new insight. What I am attempting, what Gerda Lerner is attempting to do in her book, is to trace by means of historical evidence the development of ideas, symbols, and metaphors by which patriarchal gender relations were incorporated into Western civilization. In other words, she's more interested in how the reality that we live in today today has been shaped by these ideas of the past. Where do our ideas come from? They come from our story. Where do our stories come from? They come from our experience or the experience of people in the past passing down those experiences to us in their stories. In the end, our experiences shape our stories, which shape our ideas, which then therefore shape our cultural DNA. And it is this cultural DNA, as you heard me talk about in the trailer, that tells us how we are supposed to think, act, and behave within the narrowly defined gender role that we are given at birth. So why does any of this matter? Why am I diving into this book with so much depth in this first foundational video that we're doing together? It's because she actually gives us hope. Gerda Lerner talks about how creating patriarchy was not a man-driven thing, but it was a co-creation of the society at the time, of those matrifocal or matrilineal partnership societies at that time. They co-created patriarchy. So if we co-created patriarchy together, guess what? We can co-create our way out of this. That's the hope that I have for all of us. Knowing this, I hope we can shift that blame game to empowerment for women and men. All right, we have captured a lot today. We have understood from the etymology what the root word of patriarchy means. We understand why matriarchy is not the way we want to go, but we want to go towards more partnership societies. We looked at the 10 steps Gerda Lerner outlines in her book, The Creation of Patriarchy, that allowed us to get into the ideology of the invisible framework of our society. And we've also looked at the dangers or the effects that patriarchy has on both men and everybody else in society. Knowing all of this, I really hope that you can start to shift your perspective of being able to see the world through this patriarchal lens and actually see the hope that I see when we strip away that lens and be able to look back at history and thus the present and the future through a different lens. And that's what we're going to be working on doing in an even deeper way throughout the rest of the series and always on this channel. I want you to leave me your comments now that you've digested some of this, or maybe take a moment and digest some of this and re-listen to it, because this was a really meaty first lesson. And let me know what you're seeing, what you're understanding. Let's get this conversation started and really start to explore how patriarchy has formed this invisible structure through our ideology, through our stories, our history, our mythology, in order to get it to stay as it is the primary structure and the only structure in our mental capacity, and what we can do to start to dismantle this ourselves. In our next video, we're going to talk about, is it natural order for women to submit and men to dominate? I've already pointed at this a little bit, but stay tuned for more.
All right, hopefully you got your golden nugget and you left that in the comment section. Here is what you stayed to the very end. I'm so proud of you. I know that this might be some really big, meaty conversations and topics, and not everybody is always ready to jump into these, but here's your little bonus for the next week. I want you to really evaluate your language and think about stopping and changing the order with which you use the genders. We usually always say men and women. I want you to say women and men. We usually always say God and goddesses. Try goddesses and God. Try always putting the female version of that word, the feminine version of that word first. The only time I can think of in society that we use women first is ladies and gentlemen. That's the only time. Every other time, we always go Mr. and Mrs. Try Mrs. and Mr. The purpose behind this tool, this exercise, is to get you to start paying attention to what else are we unconsciously telling ourselves when we use Mr. and Mrs. all the time. We're constantly reiterating, making sure that men always go first. And that trickles down into the rest of our belief system. So try putting women and men, sisters and brothers, her and him, flip-flopping your language as a great tool for this next week and for the rest of this next 13 lessons that we have together.